Becky, are you really climbing in?
You having wine then, Debbie?
No, I was supposed to get past the shops and I just didn't have time today.
Oh,
Are you having wine?
great?
So the only wine I've got is Pinot Grigio, which I don't think is a great match.
First of all, Debs, if you've got to go to the shops for wine, you're ready. Life, darling.
I don't believe you, Debbie. There's wine in your house somewhere.
Literally, the only wine in my house is there's a bit of red left and a bottle of Pinot Grigio. It's been a long week.
I could literally have I could have a wedding with the amount of
Do you not trust yourself or something, Debbie?
No. Have you seen me drink?
Yeah.
Delivery is an amazing thing. Look at who chose cheese. Now that's interesting. I thought maybe no one will choose cheese, and I'll be apart from Deb, and I'll be completely alone.
It was actually a pretty even split.
I love cheese. Oh God, I love it.
I didn't think I'd have any chocolate left to try in my house. If I thought the cheese would be safe.
But my God, there's enough cheese for a lot of people, isn't there, in this box?
I couldn't. It landed last week, and I couldn't for the life of me work out where it come from. And I was thinking, what is this? It just couldn't. It just seemed really bizarre. It was funny. We had another event that we had lunch for. The food seemed to be raining for the universe. It felt like Boehringer were literally feeding me. They've taken that on. There's no time for cooking or anything, so we'll just send you food to keep you alive.
Debbie, we've got 21 people. I think we were expecting 29, I think.
I think we're probably going to have a couple of people who RSVP'd early and some things come up. So I'd say get started, and if they need to catch up later, they can.
Great. Are you happy for me to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. My name is Penny Hayes, and I'm the co-founder of a company called Great Wine Online, but we've actually extended our portfolio a little bit recently to become more like Great Tastings Online, because we now do not just wine, but gin. We're looking at possibly cider. But I'm here today with my food and wine matching guru, Steve the Cheese Parker. He is called Steve the Cheese for a reason that will become very obvious fairly soon. If you wouldn't mind muting yourselves for now, just because we quite often get feedback and dogs barking or children's crying or whatever. But if you've got a question, please put it in either the chat, or if you can figure out, I'm sure you have by now, how to stick your hand up, and then we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourselves and ask us the questions as we're going along. But I hope you've all got your cheese. My cheese is beautifully running off the plate at the moment. This one in particular, can you see that with the Brie in particular? So I've tried it because it had to, because it was about to escape. So if they're all ready, we shall start. So as I said, my name's Penny. Steve, would you like to introduce yourself and explain why you're called Steve the Cheese?
Yeah, I wasn't actually christened that. I wasn't called Steve the Cheese. I made a very sound career choice quite early on in life to enter the wine business, which meant I spent many, many years traveling the world, buying wine, tasting great wines, and generally enjoying great food with the wines. One of the most common of which is cheese. And most winemakers, if you visit a winery, they will give you some of their local produce, including cheese. So I got really into this and started learning lots about cheese. So I used to go to dairies at the weekend and milk cows and make cheese and go in caves and do all this stuff, which is quite fun if you're into cows and sheep and stuff. I then decided about a dozen or so years ago to leave the corporate world and start my own business, which was called the Cheese and Wine Company. And it was a shop, and it was a restaurant, it was a bistro, and the whole thing was all about pairing food and drink, primarily cheese and wine, but extending into many other foodstuffs, including chocolate, which the other group are in. I do need to tell you folks, I looked up the statistics, I knew it was there somewhere. 74% of people, if asked whether they would give up cheese or chocolate for the rest of their life, gave up chocolate. So you are in the right room.
Absolutely.
I congratulate you on your choice.
Is this
and so Anyway, a couple of years ago, I decided that retail was too hard work as well. There's a pattern in my life that I like to change things. And I started writing and talking about cheese. And I met Penny on Zoom a year ago. I've never met her in real life. She only exists as far as the shoulders to me. And so we've been working together on a whole variety of food and drink pairings over the last year. And, you know, a huge welcome to you guys, as I'm going to take you on a little journey through the wonderful world of cheese. I will explain what you're going to have and what order and everything, so don't worry about that.
Now, Steve's been a bit shy, which is very unusual for him, by the way, but he has actually written a great book called British Cheese on Toast. Oh, he's got it there. Oh, there you go. He's not that shy. And Steve, I was reading something a couple of weeks ago. Apparently there are over 800 named cheeses now in the UK, which is phenomenal, because, you know, in the sort of 70s, 80s, there was really only cheddar and Edam. Mind you, Edam's not British, is it? But there didn't seem to be very many cheeses around, but now there are just hundreds.
To give you a 2-minute history of cheese in Britain, it's been around for thousands of years.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. We tended to have a relatively hard cheese culture, mainly because England, or large tranches of England, are quite cool, temperature-wise. That is not like Hackney. No, they're it's quite chilly, and therefore we've had a culture of making quite large, hard cheeses because they last through a long winter. And cheese making got absolutely hammered at the beginning of the last century due to the Second World War, when the Ministry of Food directed all resources from all farms into making a standard form of something called government cheddar. Can you believe it? It sounds awful just in the name, doesn't it?
Sound pretty awful.
And so a lot of artisan cheese making died out, and it was only in about the 1980s that we started getting a lot more imports of food. Now, looking around the room, there's very few of you that are as old as me, but in the 1980s, you know, we started seeing olive oil for the first time. We started seeing olives. Balsamic vinegar wasn't until about the 90s. And so we also started seeing a lot of cheeses coming in from Europe. At the same time, due to political pressure, there was a thing called the Milk Marketing Board that destroyed the price of milk for farmers. And so a lot of farmers turned back to cheese making in the 80s, to the point that there are now 4 or 5 times more cheesemakers than there were 40 years ago. And you're absolutely right. France makes less than 500 cheeses, and we make nearly 800 different ones now.
Well, I was reading a quote by Charles de Gaulle the other day. Apparently he said, "How can you govern a country with 240 varieties of cheese?" So it's even more difficult now.
Exactly.
Anyway, explain to us why you've chosen some of these cheeses tonight, which are amazing. But why have you chosen?
Well, I was just talking about 800 British cheeses. I wrote a book about British cheese on toast, and I've given you all French and Irish cheeses. So why have I done that? Is there somebody in the room here who lives in Ireland?
There was a lady who was joining us from Ireland. Maybe she's not here.
It could be one of the ones that's on side.
I'm Northern Irish, but I sadly don't live there anymore. So.
No, this was a lady.
Some great cheese in Northern Ireland. No, there was one of your colleagues, Claire, who lived in Kildare, I think it was. And one of the challenges that's come out of recent political changes, shall we say,
well done,
is that exporting things from here to European countries is very difficult, as is importing things at the moment. And therefore we changed the cheese selection so that it could be sourced in Ireland as well as in the UK. And now they haven't turned up. But there you go, that's life. Whereas because France and Ireland are both in Europe, they can get a load of French cheese, but not much English. Sounds really stupid to me. We have 5 cheeses. I've arranged them here on my little board, and hopefully you may be able to recognize them in some way. Mm-hmm. This is the order in which we're going to taste them. First of all, you have something here called Chaorse, which was like a round white drum, quite soft if it's been out of the fridge for a while.
Yeah, sticky.
We're then going to have the Brie de Meaux, which was the big slab you had that, depending how long it's been out of the fridge, depends how far it's crawled off your plate.
Absolutely.
We then have the orange one with the big dip in the top of it, which is called Langres. We then have the hard one, which was looked like a flat piece of MDF, which is Conte. And finally, from the south of Ireland, we have Crozier Blue. So that's the order that we're going to go through them in. But I'm merely going to use those as props to talk to you about cheese. I'm not at any stage going to say, and now we should eat this. So if you've been eating it all, don't worry. It's your afternoon. It's your stomach. It's your enjoyment, I hope.
So cheese is basically milk, dried out a bit with a bit of salt in it, and then flavouring of some sort. And the flavour comes from a whole range of different ways. Okay, tell me why I'm wrong.
You're absolutely right. Most people know about cheese. They know it's yellow and they know it's in the fridge, and that's generally as much as they know. Cheese is made from milk. It's normally made from the indigenous milk of animals that are indigenous to the area you're in. So in Western Europe, where we are, it's cow, it's sheep, it's goat, and sometimes buffalo. What you tend to find is mountainous countries and mountainous regions tend to have more sheep or goats cheeses because cows can't climb mountains, but goats and sheep can. As you move further east from here, you then start to get much more buffalo milk go into cheeses. If you go south of here into Africa, you'll get a lot of camel's milk cheese. In the Balkan regions and southern Russia, you'll get a lot of donkey's milk cheese. And you keep going further across, water buffalo becomes huge as you get to India. When you get to the Far East, dairy isn't a huge part of the culture. And when you get to Australia, culture isn't a huge part of the culture. So no, Australia tends to be very similar to here. If I offend any races, I do apologise. Well, no, I don't. I just do it.
Actually, in Australia, the difference I found when I was over there is they tend to eat cheese as a starter. So you quite often have cheese as an aperitif.
Yeah, a lot of people do that. Actually, it actually makes more sense than the British way of doing it, which is stick about 2 kilos of cheese on the table when you've just eaten 3 courses, and keep plugging away at it. You feel like you've got a cheese baby. That's a weird way of doing it. But no, basically, you start milk. You're absolutely right. Here's the science bit. It's fat, it's protein, it's calcium, it's lactose, which is a sugar, and it's water. They're the 5 things that are in milk. And to make the cheese, and I'll use this as a reference point as we go through, to make the cheese, you start by adding a bacteria to the milk, and that then converts the lactose into lactic acid. And it's that acidification which is what starts making the cheese. It starts clotting it a little bit, and the acidity is part of the maturation process. You then add a second substance to it, which is called rennet, which is an enzyme. And what that does is take the fat, the protein, the lactic acid you now have, and the calcium, and clumps it into lumps called curds, and separates out the water, which is whey. You can then take those curds, put them into a little mold, they'll settle into a shape, and a day or so later you can eat it as a cheese. Depending what you do from that stage onwards and just around that, depends on the type of cheese you end up with. And I will refer back to that process as we go through here.
You talked about, obviously different countries and different animals, and presumably, whereas in wine we have the French especially tend to talk about terroir, which is all about the environment in which the grapes are growing, so the soil, the climate, that sort of thing. Presumably you get something similar depending on where the animals are grazing.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Penny. For a start, if you take a cow, most of us drive down the road and we see a field and we recognize something called a cow. Cows are divided into 2 major types. There's beef cattle and there's dairy cattle. You can always tell the difference for those who aren't farmers. I'll be a little crude, but this will explain it. Beef cattle have big fat bums. Dairy cows have little skinny bums. It's basically because you want lots of meat off the hindquarter. So if you see like a Hereford or an Aberdeen Angus or something, be very broad in the beam. Whereas an Ayrshire or a Frisian, where you want all the energy to go into the milk, tend to be really skinny and bony at the back.
Right, brilliant.
So that's the breed of cattle. But then if you feed the cow in one field, and then the next week you do it in the neighbouring field, the subsoil, whether it's limestone or clay or chalk or sand, will have a very profound effect on the milk, because the milk is only converted grass after all.
Yeah, cool.
And even worse, even if you keep it in the same field, every day the milk will be different, because it depends on how much it's rained. The more rain you have, the more water will go into the milk, and therefore it will affect how the finished cheese is.
Interesting, which is why they'll be slightly different every time you try them, just like wine in a way, just like vintage
Correct.
wines. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try the first one, because I'm sure everybody's desperate
Right.
to try
So
it.
the first cheese is called Chaorse.
Chaorse. Okay. This is the little white round one.
It's like a little white round drum. Yeah. It's not the easiest word to say in the world when you get 3 vowels in sequence, but it's Chaorse. It's named after a village in Burgundy of the same name, Chaorse.
Can you eat the rind?
Okay, you can eat the rind on any cheese unless it's wax,
Right.
because it's only dried cheese. There are some cheeses where it lends itself more to it than others, and this is one of them. I would absolutely advocate you eat the rind, but at the end of the day, it's your taste, it's your decision. Don't let anybody tell you what you should and shouldn't do.
Wow, that's absolutely just so creamy.
So what you've got here is something that's called a triple cream cheese.
Right.
So if we refer back to my cheese making talk of a minute, then when you've got your curds and you've separated the whey off, you're left with these curds, which are really soft, sort of jelly-like pieces. Before putting it into a mold for a shape, what these guys do is then add a quantity of double cream equivalent to the amount of cream that was in the original milk. So they've skimmed some milk and added the cream to it, and then they mix it all up. And then, having done that, they then do the same thing again. So this curd ends up with 3 times more cream than normal.
Wow.
Now, the reason is anybody enjoying this cheese? Or
Absolutely
yeah,
delicious. Yeah.
Evelyn's giving it the double thumb. That's good. So most cheese, if you don't mind me using the F word here, most cheese has a fat content of between 25 and 35%. That's slightly over exaggerated for those that ever think about dieting, because what they do is they take a piece of cheese, like this piece of Comte I've picked up, and to measure the fat content, they dry it in an oven and drive all the moisture out of it. So all the moisture's gone. And then they measure the fat content of the dry solids that are left, which is fine for scientific purposes, but that's not what you're doing. You're eating it like this. So the declared fat content is actually about twice what the fat content is of the cheese you're eating. Wow. So that's the first bit of good news. The second bit of good news about the F word is you will eat this afternoon more calcium than your body needs for a week. Very, very rich in calcium, cheese. And calcium is not absorbed or metabolized by the human body. Calcium is used to build bones and hair and teeth. But what isn't required immediately passes straight through your digestive system and is disposed of naturally. But that calcium acts as a magnet to any fat particles in your digestive system. So if there's any fat floating around, the calcium sort of hoovers it all up and then disposes of it all. So really, you're on a diet. And for those that were wise enough to have some wine with their cheese, you've got the grapes in there as well. So this is a really sort of healthy thing you're doing.
Absolutely. Now, what did you recommend with this particular to drink with this particular cheese?
Well, I gave some general recommendations. Did you all get them? Some ideas? Yeah, brilliant. Okay. This is a soft, creamy cheese. The best thing to have with this. Sorry, just going back to the F word. Most cheese is 25 to 35% fat. Chaorse is 74% fat. That's why you're loving it.
Absolutely, I know.
But you've now understood that has some caveats around it. Now, this is soft and creamy and delicious. The very, very best thing in the world to drink with this cheese is champagne. Preferably a Blanc de Blanc champagne made from 100% Chardonnay. But, you know, it's 5 to 4 on a Wednesday afternoon, so you're probably not hitting the champagne. So a full-bodied white wine would be quite lovely, like a Chardonnay or a white Rioja or a Viognier, something like that. If you insisted on having a red wine, and white wine will generally go better with cheeses than red, we may come back to that later.
Yeah, we will.
Something like a Beaujolais or a Pinot Noir has got a nice lighty fruitiness that would go nicely.
Yeah, I can imagine the Pinot Noir would go.
Somebody made the comment earlier on, Pinot Grigio is a really, really bad wine to have with cheese. Good Pinot Grigio is amazing. No, I stress the word good. Good Pinot Grigio is amazing, but it's not really that good for cheese, nor is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And I know I've just dismissed two hugely popular wine styles, but they just don't work that well with it.
Well, for two different reasons. I mean, Pinot Grigio, you know my views about Pinot Grigio. It tastes of virtually nothing unless it's a really, really good one. And whereas Sauvignon Blanc, especially New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, tastes almost of too much, so it will overpower this cheese, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, Penny, and you've heard me say this before, it's your stomach.
Yes.
If you want to drink black coffee with this, and that floats your boat, you do it. And, you know, don't let wine waiters or waiters or restaurateurs tell you what you can or can't do. It's your decision. I can only give you the best advice. But pear juice is really good, actually, which is one of the things I put on there. And also elderflower cordial. Nice. They can both be very good.
So something fruity is what you're saying with this, I think, with the wines you've chosen.
Yeah, and with some texture.
Yeah.
You need some texture, which is that sort of how thick it feels in the mouth, as it were, because the cheese is very creamy and lovely and delicious. If you hadn't opened this cheese, and this is my superb tip for buying cheese, if you're buying chicken or fish, you buy something that has a really long life on it, so it's best before date. With most cheeses, it's a best before date, not a use date. And I'll just explain how it works. This is where I'll save you a fortune and you will improve the quality of cheese you eat. If you can imagine a graph, I'll take a blank sheet of paper. So if you take a graph, and along the bottom axis is time, and along the up axis is maturity. Cheese matures like this. It goes like that. So as time goes along, it matures. If you've got a really big hard cheese, like a massive cheddar or a Comte or something like that, the line that it matures will be really, really gradual. It'll take a long, long time to mature. Could be years. But then when it's matured, it will stay in great condition for a long, long, long time. If you've got a small cheese like this, it will mature really quickly, like 2 or 3 weeks. But then it will stay at peak maturity for a very short time before it starts to tail off. And so if you ever smell ammonia in cheese, that means it's gone too far. But this is the clever thing. I would always advocate that you should buy cheese from specialist cheese shops because they're really good at what they do. But if you find yourself in a supermarket and feel inclined to buy cheese, the one thing they will always do is reduce the price of something the day before the best before date. By very nature, cheese is in perfect condition at the best before date and for several days afterwards, depending how hard or soft it is. So if you happen to see this stuff, Chaorse, in the supermarket, it'll cost you about 3 or 4 quid, the cheese that we sent you, something like that. The chances are they will have reduced the price of that. And even if they haven't, buy it as close as you can to the best before date, because that's when it'll be beautifully soft. And by then, with this cheese, you'll be able to cut the lid off and dip into it. It'll be so soft and creamy. You can probably see it breaking down a bit under the rind already. It's going soft and creamy. What will happen, the whole cheese will be like that, and you can use it as like a dip. It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous.
Well, Becky's put a comment here about the number of crackers that she's eating with it. And we would normally say to people, try and get a fairly bland. I mean, obviously, Carr's water biscuits are great because they're just plain. They don't really taint, so you can really taste the cheese properly. So they're not too fattening.
No, I mean, at the end of the day, crackers or bread are merely a platform for getting it plate to your mouth.
No, exactly.
I tend to eat cheese with cheese and not anything else.
Yes, and somebody else has said chutneys, and I think again something like this would probably be a bit too delicate for the spiciness that you get in a
I mean, Natasha's asked the question, and the fact is, if you do like some chutney or something, we'll have it, you know.
Yeah.
As I said earlier on in the intro, I used to own a cheese shop, and one of my biggest selling was a chili chutney. Now, I can't think of anything worse than putting chili chutney with cheese, but it's the sort of thing particularly blokes tend to do. It's like, raw chili, bring it on. If I was going to have something with this, my universal accompaniment to cheese, which is another cost-saving tip here, is marmalade. A good quality marmalade goes beautifully with cheese, absolutely beautifully, and it's not some expensive stuff. Lime pickle, well, Evelyn, that's pretty hardcore.
Yeah, that is hardcore.
I think you're getting that mixed up with your curry, mate. No, lime pickle, it's if it works for you. But if I was having a chutney with this, I would think something quite like a sort of gooseberry preserve or something like that would be quite nice, because the sharpness would counteract the stuff here. Or a very light fruit one, like a plum or damson or something.
Excellent. Oh, well, having a mother that makes masses of homemade jams, I should be getting some of those and trying them with this. Right, let's talk about the next cheese, which is the Brie de Meaux. Now, there's lots of Bries around, aren't there? Somerset Brie and all sorts of Brie. What's the difference? What's the difference between the different Bries? Or is there one?
Right.
Scraping
if you were to leave Paris and head to Euro Disney,
yes,
and keep going, about half an hour later, you'd come to a town called Tournon-en-Brie.
Right.
And that is where Brie was created. In my opinion, as a professional turophile, a turophile, folks, is a lover of cheese.
How do you spell that?
Turo, T-U-R-O, file. The original and best Brie is what you've got in front of you, which is Brie de Meaux. Meaux is a village that is neighbouring to Tournon-en-Brie, and it's an AOC cheese, which means it's appellation controlled in the same way Champagne is, or Stilton, or these things that are protected. And this is a 3 kilo cheese. It's made by hand. The curds are ladled by hand, which is a way of keeping real softness and delicacy. And it's got a flavour, a sort of mushroomy type flavour, and a creaminess. It's absolutely gorgeous. Other cheesemakers throughout the world have copied this style of cheese, and they have called it Brie. Now, that's entirely their prerogative. You get Somerset Brie, you get Cornish Brie. In my humble opinion, why don't they just give it a new name? Yeah. There's a lady in Berkshire who makes an amazing Brie-style cheese that she calls Waterloo, and it's fabulous.
Yeah.
But people have used it. I think the difference between this and those other ones is huge, but it's a matter of personal taste.
This is so soft. As I said to you before, it was literally running off the cheese board earlier. It was just fantastic, and you don't get that very often with some of the other Bries that you've mentioned. I don't think they tend to be a bit more stodgy. This is absolutely delicious.
Charlotte has mentioned fruitcake, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Completely agree with you, Charlotte, but not with these two cheeses. Fruitcake lends itself really well to what are called the British territorial cheeses, the hard crumbly ones like Lancashire, Wensleydale, cheddar, things like that. In fact, there was a programme on TV last night where they were in Yorkshire and they were serving Wensleydale on fruitcake.
Now, you mentioned that this Brie comes in a big round. I mean, we all got quite a big chunk of it from the round. Why are different cheeses made in different sizes? Why do you see some that are big? Why do you see a little like this the first one, the Chaorse?
Different sizes tend to be a product of what you're making and why you're making it. So a smaller cheese will always ripen faster than a big cheese. That's just a fact. It's also a lot of them now are tradition, what's been traditionally done, but originally it was sort of what you had available. So if you take Manchego, a very hard sheep's cheese from Spain, that used to be made as the mold they used was baskets that they made out of reeds by the river in La Mancha. And that's why you end up with this sort of zigzaggy pattern on the outside of Manchego, because from the grass. There's a cheese called Berkswell that's made in the West Midlands that looks like an ammonite or a flying saucer. And the reason it's that shape is because when they started off, they weren't sure. It was very small dairy. And the easiest thing to use as a mold was kitchen colanders, and they got a whole load of them at the local hardware shop. And that's why the shape of the cheese is what it is.
There's no real scientific thing here. It's just what's available.
Yeah, so it becomes a pure tradition thing, Penny. I mean, there's a really interesting story about Brie here, actually. There's another cheese that's very similar to Brie, and people sometimes sort of think of them as interchangeable. That's Camembert. Because they look very similar. They both have a very soft white rind. And the thing about the soft white rind is that there's a bacteria added to the cheese called Penicillium candidum, candidum being Latin for white. And this bacteria is it's what's called aerobic. So it needs oxygen to grow. And therefore it grows beautifully on the outside of the cheese. But bacteria isn't very intelligent, so it doesn't know which way is out. So it goes off in every single direction, including burrowing into the cheese. Of course, the minute it burrows into the cheese, there's no oxygen and it dies. And then a moment later, another bacteria comes wandering along, sees this nice looking hole and dives down and gets a little bit further before it dies. Now, I'm talking submicroscopic here when I say bacteria. I mean, really, really submicroscopic. And this happens millions of times every minute. But it's that action, which is why cheeses like that, these soft white rinded cheeses, ripen from the rind inwards.
Inwards, okay.
And so you notice if you buy one that's got quite a long date on it, it's got like a chalky bit in the middle, still quite hard. And that's because it hasn't broken down. So I refer to my earlier comments about best before dates.
Right.
But the link between this and Camembert, back in the day, in the time of Napoleon, one of the things Napoleon did was persecute the Catholic Church. So there was Catholic priests all over France running away to hide, quite naturally, you know, frightened for their lives. And there was a chap called Charles Jean Bonvust, and he started off somewhere in northeastern France, and he went right across northern France and ended up in Normandy, and he sought and got shelter from a farmer's wife, a lady called Marie Harel. Now, Monsieur Harel was away fighting in the wars. And so Marie Harel very kindly put this priest up. While he was staying there, he was watching her make cheese. And he said, probably in a much better French accent than mine, no, he said, Madame, would you know, where I come from, they make cheese. And it's sort of a bit like yours, but I could sort of show you what we do, and it might improve yours in some way. Now, because she was a lady and because he was a priest, she accepted his offer. And he showed her how to make the cheese. He came from Tournon-en-Brie. The village that she lived in was Camembert. And that's why the two cheeses have become incredibly similar. If you then jump forward 100 years, there was a Monsieur Ridel moved out to Camembert, saw this lovely cheese that was only distributed within about 5 kilometers of the village because there was no way of transporting things really. And he invented a little wooden box to put it into, made of a very lightweight wood, so that you could stack the cheeses. And this was the same year that the railway came from Paris to Camembert, and therefore they were able to ship it into Paris, and it went off and became a huge thing. Whereas Brie has stayed as a big 3 kilos.
It seems to be a bit of a thing, monks and priests producing cheese as well, in the same way as they are very famous for a lot of the wines that we drink. Presumably because they had lots of time on their hands, so they could take care of these things and make them beautiful.
Well, if you go back into the origins, I mean, cheese was discovered by accident, but for many thousands of years, the reason cheese exists was that it was a way of preserving milk.
Yeah.
Because even in what I used to call the olden days when I was a kid, even in the olden days, people realized the nutritional value of milk, but it goes off quite quickly. Whereas if you turn it into cheese, you maintain all the nutrient value of the milk, but in a form that you can keep it. And monks tended to control a lot of farming, and therefore they had herds of, you know, cows and things like that. They used to make a lot of cheeses, and we'll refer to the monk connection very shortly. The other thing that's of interest is that most cheesemakers in the world are ladies.
Is that true?
Artisan farmhouse cheesemakers, or they have descended from the ladies that started it. And the reason being that throughout history, men stupidly have spent a lot of time going to war and fighting each other. And therefore, traditionally, the women would be at home on the farm and they would look after the clever, skillful things, whereas men would either be fighting or ploughing or something like that. And so there's so many cheeses that are named after ladies now, and probably 70% of the artisan cheese made in this country is made by ladies.
Yes, you quite often mention these ladies. You've obviously met quite a few of them.
Mm. Well, I can tell you one just out of interest that I haven't mentioned. Claudine Rousseau, who is the lady that makes this brie.
She's superb. She's very good.
75 years old, wears heels about 3 to 4 inches high, wears skirts that her granddaughter shouldn't wear. They're so short and so low cut.
Oh, I love her already.
And drinks a bottle of champagne before midday every day.
Excellent.
When I used to go and see Claudine in Brie, I would also always make sure I had a meeting at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning.
Definitely. So I'm presuming
After that, she's rubbish. She's brilliant.
I'm assuming then that champagne's a good thing to drink with this particular.
Oh, God, yes.
Excellent.
Absolutely. A great thing. Champagne, actually, yes. Charlotte, I love your comment.
My idol. Yeah, exactly.
The champagne is universally probably one of the best wines you can drink with cheese, or a fairly rich, full-bodied white, sorry, like a Chardonnay or something, or a light red. Yeah.
Now, Jenny has asked us how we keep this cheese. What I'm going to do in the chat is I'm going to put a link to an article that Steve wrote, which is actually on our website, which is all about storing and serving cheese. But this particular, well, actually, both the first one and the brie, what's the best way to keep them?
Right. The key to keeping cheese is to remember that until you bought it or it arrived at your house, this cheese has breathed through its rind for its entire life.
Right.
So don't strangle it and suffocate it. Let it breathe through the rind. And therefore, as a general principle, you only ever wrap the cut face, the bit that's been cut and exposed to the air. The rind, it's perfectly okay to breathe through that. The preferred medium is cheese paper, which you would get from a specialist cheese shop. If not, use greaseproof paper or something. If not, you can use cling film. Do not use tin foil, but you can use cling film. But only cut as I say, the cut, only wrap the cut face. And best thing is to put it into a container like a plastic box or something and keep it in the salad drawer at the bottom of the fridge, because most domestic fridges are too dry and they dry cheese out and then it cracks. And that's when you start getting really sort of quite unpleasant looking molds in it. Whereas if you keep the moisture.
We did, you and I did a tasting a couple of weeks ago for a group of ladies, and one of them in particular said that she'd received the cheese a couple of weeks beforehand and she hadn't put it in the fridge, she'd kept it out, and that's the way she likes it. Yeah,
I know her. She's sort of a friend. She's a weirdo. No, she likes cheese that is overripe, over strong, over stinky. Cheese that should have been thrown away. She likes to eat it.
Okay, fair enough.
But it's her choice. It's her decision.
So talking about stinky, the next cheese we're going to taste is the Langres, which has got the sort of yellowy orange, very, very sticky outer skin and a dip in the middle.
Yeah. So this is Langres. It's named after a village in Burgundy called Langres. There's a couple of unusual things you notice about this. One, it's got a dip in the top of it, which makes it very unusual. And normally when you're maturing a cheese, each day you turn it over. The reason you turn it over is so that the curd can set evenly throughout. The guys in Langres decided, for whatever reason, there's a legend that says they forgot, but they don't turn it. And therefore it settles unevenly and you get this dip in the top, which is called a cuvette. What's traditional in the village of Langres is if you serve this cheese, you put it out at the start of the meal and you fill up the dip at the top with champagne.
Oh, no. And
then you let it soak into the cheese during the meal and have it at the end. Waste of good cheese, waste of good champagne.
I agree. Totally.
The other thing you notice about this is it's orange. And you see quite a few cheeses of this orange colour. This is another technique used in cheese making, which was pioneered by monks. It's called washed rind. And basically what you do is when you've made a cheese and it's starting to mature, from the first day you take it out of the mold, you wash it daily. If it's a little cheese like this, you get a bucket of salt water and you dunk the cheese into it and put it back on the shelf.
Is it always salt water that you wash it with?
Not always, no.
Ah, okay.
If it's a great big cheese, you get a cloth and you wash it all over. You can use alcohol. So there's a cheese that's made not far from Langres called Époisse that's washed in a grape spirit. It's like a brandy. There's a cheese made in the UK called Stinking Bishop that's washed with a perry made from pears.
Nice.
And there's some cheeses that are made with beer to wash the outside. And why do they do this? Well, when you wash the outside of the cheese, it encourages the growth of a bacteria called Brevibacterium linens. And Brevibacterium linens does three things to a cheese. One, it makes the rind orangey, pinky colour, slightly sticky and soft. Secondly, it makes it pungent. Natasha has commented on this. In the scale of pungency, this is probably about halfway along it, Natasha. So you can get much stronger than these, but it does give it that pungency, that smelly cheese sort of thing.
Yeah.
Thirdly, it makes it quite fruity. And it's that fruitiness that appeals to people about it. The reason monks used to do this is, one, they wanted to keep their cheeses and it was a way of extending the life of a soft cheese. But secondly, it gives the cheese a slightly meaty characteristic. And if you sort of suspend disbelief for a moment, it's almost got like a meaty flavour. And a lot of monastic orders would only eat meat once a week, or sometimes only once a month, depending on whichever sort of branch of their religion they were following. And therefore they felt this was a good way of putting meaty umami flavours back into their diet.
It's got a sort of a slightly meaty texture to it. It's quite an interesting one.
It's delicious.
Yeah, Erin says it's not her favourite. I am actually kind of with her on that so far. It's not my favourite so far either. It's almost got a farmyardy smell to it, which maybe is putting me off a bit.
That's exactly what they're looking for, to be honest.
Okay. Well, there you go. But I don't like the idea of putting champagne in it. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a bit of a waste of champagne. What would I drink with this one then? Presumably champagne.
Right. This tends to lend itself to something like a Burgundy, so red Burgundy. So a Pinot Noir would be really, really nice with this.
Excellent.
This would go really nicely with a cider. This would go really nicely with Calvados.
Apple brandy.
Yeah, it goes rather nicely with a peaty single malt whiskey, something from Isla or something like that, or Skye, somewhere like that. And there are some wines made in that area that tend, wines from like the Savoy Mountains and the Jura Mountains that go particularly well with this. Dry sherry is another thing that goes really nicely with this.
We often say that, don't we, that if you're looking for things to go together, wines and foods to go together, look at where they both come from, and you usually find that the two things tend to go together really well.
Just to help Natasha and Jenny and validate their views, the Brevibacterium that I referred to that makes this go orange is exactly the same bacteria that gives you smelly feet.
There you go. That's really
so when
cool.
people make jokes about smelly feet and cheese, there is some scientific basis in what they're saying.
That's really put them off now.
Only telling you the truth.
Now, the next one we're going to try is the Comte, which, as you know, Steve, is one of my favourite cheeses, the hard Alpine cheeses. So that's the one we got a sort of slab of. As you said, it looks like a piece of MDF. Now, presumably, that is a huge cheese that we got a slice.
Now, I refer to my earlier comment. I wouldn't eat the rind on this if I were you, because it's been matured for about 2 years and it's like wood. This actually is a washed rind cheese, strangely enough. They wash the rind on this one, but mature it for 2 years. Conte is one of the most fascinating cheeses in the world, in my opinion.
Delicious.
It is made using the... Is anybody here listening to the Archers?
Yes.
Give it a quick look. Come on, you can confess. It's all right. If you listen to the Archers, you'll know that Helen Archer has a herd of Montbéliard cows.
It does.
This is made from the milk of Montbéliards. It's made in the Jura, which is the area to the north of Geneva, just over the border into France. So it's a mountainous region. It's where Raymond Blanc comes from, and you'll see he often raves around about Comte. This is made in an interesting method. Traditionally, the farmers in the Jura Mountains would have about 4 or 5 cows, which was fine for their domestic milk requirement. But when they got the cows involved in, here's a word for you, transhumance. Transhumance is when animals move from one location to another on a diurnal basis. So twice a year they go back and forwards. So what they do is they take their cows up the mountains onto the fresh grass that's been exposed as the snow has melted, and they graze them up there in the mountains. And when you're up in the mountains and you're making cheese, there's no point making a little diddy cheese like that, because it's going to go off before you get home, and you're going to be there for 6 months. So you need to make a great big cheese. Problem is, you can't make a great big cheese because you've only got 4 cows. So what you do is you get together with a load of your mates who've got 4 cows each, and you pool your milk. And these little sort of cooperatives, they're called fruitières, which is a lovely word. And a fruitière of people get together and they make one of these cheeses each day. And a Conte by law is 42 kilos.
Oh, I see that. So there's.
They're massive.
It has to be that size. 42 kilos. That's enormous.
They're massive. They're about 1 meter across. So they make one of these each day and they bring it down the mountain at the end of the season by strapping the cheeses to the back of the cows. So the cows not only have given the milk to make the cheeses, but they've also the transport to bring it back down to the village. Once they get back down to the village, they can't make Conte anymore, because by law, Conte has to be made with milk from cows that have grazed on fresh pasture.
So is that an AOC as well?
It is an AOC, but the minute they come down and they go off fresh pasture and onto silage, they make a cheese called Vacherin Mont d'Or, which some of you may or may not have tried, which is soft creamy cheese.
Yes.
Same
totally
cheese.
Different.
Same milk, totally different cheese.
Totally different cheese. Now,
This cheese.
Sorry, Steve, you and I are doing a wine tasting tomorrow night, and we've got a Savoie Jura wine in there. So shall I keep some to try with that tomorrow night?
I certainly would.
Great, good.
Now, the thing with this, when these farmers get back down, I mean, they're exhausted. They've been 6 months up in the mountains. And this is where a thing that's almost peculiar to the French cheese industry comes in. They are met by a group of people who say, let's have a look at your cheeses. Now, that's not an expression you hear that often, but these people are called affineurs. Now, an affineur is a cheese ripener. That's a job, a ripener of cheese.
Ripener?
Right, yeah, somebody who ripens cheese or matures it. And it's totally separate from being a cheese maker. And so these affineurs will then choose the Contes they want, depending on the farmers that they know and the fruitières, these little cooperatives, and they will choose which ones they're going to mature. So when you buy this cheese, you're not buying it from a farm or a farmer, you're buying it from the maturer. But that's not that unusual, because here in the UK, if you want to buy meat, you don't buy it from a farm, you buy it from a butcher.
Yeah, that's true.
And you trust the butcher to have selected the best meat.
And hung it properly. Interesting.
Yeah, so same thing happens. Now, this particular one is made by the best affineur in the world. His name is Marcel Petit. And Marcel Petit bought a Maginot Line fort from the French government for 1 franc. And he's got this massive fort in the Jura Mountains with tunnels and tunnels and tunnels, and it's full of cheese. If you're ever on holiday in that part of the world, in the Jura, go to Fort Saint-Antoine. It's owned by Marcel Petit, and they call it the Cathedral of Cheese. It is awesome. You just walk in, and it is literally like being in a cathedral. It's just full of cheeses. Or look it up on the web.
Phenomenal.
Fort Saint-Antoine. It is awesome. Great cheese. Nutty, caramelly, almost sweet in its way.
It is. No, I love Comte, and I could eat quite happily 42 kilos of it. It's absolutely delicious.
Good luck. It'll cost you about 1,200 quid.
Yeah, I know, a lot. So the last cheese is the only blue one actually that you've suggested. Now, I think blue cheese kind of happened by accident, didn't it? I suppose the myth or the legend is that.
Just to explain, I've only chosen one blue, Penny.
Yeah.
To my mind, the perfect cheese board is 5 cheeses.
Right.
No, to my mind, the perfect cheese board is one cheese, a big piece of one really good cheese. But if
Okay.
you're going to mix, go for 5. And
Right.
traditionally, I would say a goat or a sheep,
Yeah.
a soft, creamy cow,
Yeah.
a washed rind, like a pungent one, a hard cheese, and a blue cheese. Now, I know that some of the folks here tonight didn't particularly want goat's cheeses, so I substituted the goat for the triple cream at the start.
Brilliant.
Goat would have given a complete balance. That's why we've got one blue.
Now they say that the blue started accidentally. The legend is that a shepherd who was fleeing from bandits left his bread and cheese on the side of the road, and when he came back for it, the bread had gone mouldy, and the mould had gone into the cheese and made a blue cheese. And I think some blue cheese makers do actually put bread in the room where they're making the cheese, so that to encourage that mould development, don't they?
Yeah, you're such an unromantic, Penny. The more romantic version of that story is that this young shepherd boy who came from the village of Soulzon, it's actually called Soulzon-sur-Roquefort, was grazing his sheep when a young maiden caught his eye, and it was her that distracted him for
not the bandits.
leave his lunch in the cave. The reality is, the cave that this happened in is actually a cave called Campolou, just outside Roquefort, so Soulzon. And if you were making Roquefort in the southwest of France, in order to call it Roquefort, it has to be matured in that cave. And the reason being that scientists went into that cave and isolated spores of a bacteria that is now called Penicillium roqueforti, that is the basis of 95% of the world's blue cheeses.
So obviously different blue cheeses taste different, and that's not because the mold is different. Then it's the environment that they're matured in.
It's the milk, it's the terroir that you referred to. It's how long they've matured it for, how they handle the curd, millions of different things. But this is the same blue mold that you would find in a Stilton, that you'd find in a Gorgonzola, that you'd find in a Roquefort. This one actually comes from a little village called Feltard, and it's between Tipperary and Waterford.
Oh, in Ireland?
In Southern Ireland there.
Yeah.
So if you went from Waterford on the coast across to Tipperary, you'd go through Feltard. In fact, it's just outside a small town called Cashel, and the creamery is called Cashel. It's owned by a guy called Louis Grubb, and his first and sort of seminal cheese was called Cashel Blue, which is a cow's milk cheese. But what he's done here, he's used a sheep's milk, and he's called this Crozier Blue.
Really?
So I thought it was a cheese that you possibly wouldn't have tried before, but you would think it was like other cheeses that you had tried before.
It's quite salty, isn't it? Which leads me to think that a fresh acidic white wine would be good with that.
Oh, no.
Oh.
No.
Well,
Port. Tawny port.
I'm not so sure about this port and cheese business. I think that was just a trend when they both came, they both...
Shall I tell you how it developed? Does anybody want to know where the port and cheese thing came from? Back in the day, there was a cheese made in Nottinghamshire, which was a blue cheese. And there was a young lad who worked at the dairy, and his sister got a job working in a pub on the Great North Road, which is now the A1. And she said to him, that cheese you make is lovely, but it's only available in the village. Why don't I take some to work in this pub that I work at 10 miles away, and I will sell it to the travellers going up and down the Great North Road. Now, the pub she worked in was called The Bell in a village of Stilton, which is still there today. That's in Leicestershire now. You can't make Stilton cheese in Stilton. It has to be made in Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire or Leicestershire. But what happened was, this was the blue cheese from Stilton, which is where people bought it rather than where it was made. And that's how it became known as Stilton. But in those days, the hygiene standards were not as good as they are now. And Stilton, and in fact, all blue cheeses are quite moist. They got quite a creamy texture. You don't get a hard blue cheese.
Yeah.
And what would happen, I'm glad we left this towards the end, what would happen is, when you cut the top off the cheese, quite often it would be ridden with maggots.
Oh, God.
Because it was so awful, the conditions. So at that same time, we were at war with both France and Spain, and therefore our only place we could get wine from then was Portugal. So we fell in love with port, and that's where the British love affair with port started. If you look at the names of port houses, they're not Portuguese names. You know, Taylors, Grahams.
Yeah.
You know, these are all English names. And so what would happen is they realised that maggots hate alcohol. So they took the only wine they had, which was port, poured it into the middle of their cheese, and all the maggots went to the outside of the cheese, leaving the middle of the cheese perfectly clean and clear. But so that you wouldn't run any risk of contamination from maggots, you'd get a silver spoon and dip it in to get the cheese out. So now if you go to a really posh dinner party, they put a stilton on the table, they give you a silver spoon and a glass of port, thinking you're being really sophisticated, but that's actually the story behind where it.
Yeah, but don't tell the story about the maggots. Revolting.
Anyway, that's Chaorse Blue from Tipperary.
Steve, they were all absolutely delicious. Langres, not so sure about. Can I have a quick show of hands before we go? Whose favourite cheese was the first one? The Chaorse. Yeah, I think so too. What about the second one, which was the Brie? Third one, the Langres, the orangey one.
Well done, Debbie. Good choice.
The last one, which was the blue.
Missed out the Conte.
Oh, sorry, I missed out the Comte. Yeah, which is my favourite. Yeah, Comte is my favourite too. So that's universally got the hands up.
Just to help you there, Conte is France's biggest selling cheese, and it outsells Brie and Camembert put together.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Well, given that, you know, as we said earlier, in the sort of 70s and 80s, all we were eating was cheddar or Cheshire. I think this has been a really interesting exploration of the different cheeses available, Steve, and it was really delicious. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask Steve the Cheese? Stick your hand up and we'll unmute yourself. If not, I know some of you have got other meetings to go to, so we'll love you and leave you.
Any questions, anyone?
Any questions? I've done a recording of this, so if you would like it, I think there's a couple of people who left, so they might want to have the stories for the last few cheeses. I'll make sure that Debbie, where are you? Debbie, you get the copy of it. Yeah.
Lovely, and thanks very much.
That could be helpful if you're having the cheeses over the weekend, because I'm sure you won't eat them all tonight.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Nice to meet everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.